Hello everybody, this is Professor Angelo again. This is our second installment of the Early American History program. Today we're going to be talking about England's colonies in North America. This would now going to be referred to as, and as you guys remember, this is our one of our authors who you can get on the Canvas download and get some additional information if you want. So if you can imagine what it was like if you were a Native American standing on the beach of North Carolina or Virginia or Massachusetts or any of other places, and suddenly here come these big wooden ships out of the horizon. Many of these Indians faced a very difficult decision. What were they going to do with these strangers from Europe? Some of them immediately tried to defend themselves and kill the Europeans. Others embraced them, offering them gifts and helping them get started in their own settlements by explaining how to grow corn, or other types of adaptations, some period referred to as the seasoning among Europeans. Over time, but the Europeans brought infectious diseases that killed millions of the Native American peoples over the years. And as a result, whether by force or disease, the Native American population plummeted by the 18th century. Others were pushed westward beyond the frontier. And as a result, North America, primarily a European civilization and unfortunately a dying native population. So for being part of the rest of European continent, the British Isles were able to develop in relative isolation compared to the rest of Europe. And by the time of the English first colonies, right, most of the feudal remnants of England were on the wane. So the beliefs that get in here are that are different as opposed to, say, other European powers was this concept of liberty. The English historical period had seen that there had been forced limits on the monarch to things called the divine right of kings. So particularly the document, the Magna Carta, limited the power of the monarchy. And so you didn't have the same absolutist monarchical systems that you would see in France or Spain, Portugal. And so this difference is going to be articulated in various ways in the British New World. So the growth of trade is also going to be a big deal because the British, obviously being an island nation, are going to naturally adapt to a naval type of situation, which made them very good people at trade. And so this expansion would see the birth of government-supported monopolies in trade and the creation of corporations capable of developing and maintaining colonies in the New World. When Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, she left no children, or I should say no direct heirs to herself. So the throne went to James VI of Scotland, who would rule as James I of England. He was now, of course, having come from outside of England, he was not vested in that concept of limited power. And this is going to lead to a big mix-up for British history. So the interesting thing about this is, if you have a somewhat comfortable understanding of the monarchs, well then the colonial history actually becomes a little bit easier because a lot of the places in America are going to be named after monarchs or after British noblemen or some concept thereof. And so the dates correspond rather nicely. And so if you have that background, you'll find the information a lot more straightforward. So again, the British development in the 1600s was very much away from this idea of divine right absolutism. And instead, there was this concept of English liberties. So in 1215, we get the Magna Carta, and then later we'll see other English dealings come into play. The concept of a corporation and what we refer to as English enterprise is the notion that instead of having one entity absorbing all the risk of any economic venture, you can spread that risk among many individuals through investments, what we today call stocks, right? And what's going to be called the joint stock companies that are going to actually finance a lot of the early settlement. So the Parliament of England had evolved basically since the Magna Carta. And there was always a certain tension between something that I refer to as dual sovereignty. So since the Magna Carta, the king and the lords ideally governed England together, dual sovereignty. And in American speak today, that would be a form of federalism. You have your central authority, the king, and your local authorities, the members of the lords, right? The men who represented the various fiefs and kingdoms of England. And so we take a lot of that into our own political thinking. But the Stuarts, who emerge into English history from Scotland in 1603, don't share that same history, as it were. They were more in tune with the old concept of divine right absolutism that had come out of medieval thinking. And so we had James the First, followed by Charles the First, his son. And now, what happens is Charles I decides to govern England sans parliament. So rather than fight with the parliament over the budgets, which he was supposed to do according to the Magna Carta, which is the power of the purse granted to the lords, he instead decided to shut down the parliament on a few occasions. And when the tension became so great, he actually went into Parliament and started to try to arrest members of the Parliament. This led to the English Civil Wars, 1642 until 49, when Charles I is beheaded, and the Parliament decides to govern on its own. And we get a time period referred to as the interregnum, because it was a period between two reigns of monarchs. And Oliver Cromwell became Lord High Protector of what was called the Commonwealth and Protectorate of England. And the colonies are going to be directly impacted by this, because during this period, the English were, in a sense, too busy thinking about their situation to deal with us. So if you kind of follow the narrative, James I comes to the throne in 1603. Jamestown on the James River is established in 1807. And so you can begin to understand how this is, working out. And so when Cromwell comes to power, there are English settlements in the southern part of what is the colonies, and in an area that's going to be called New England. The middle colonies, which are New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, are part of what's called the New Netherlands. But it's during this time that England's too busy worrying about its internal affairs to worry about colonial affairs. And so many of the colonies are left to fend for themselves, a period of salutary neglect, if you will, where the colonies were left to figure things out on their own. So when Charles II is restored to the throne in 1660, he's coming to the throne under the agreement that he would, in a sense, not follow in his father's footsteps. And it's during his restoration period that we get what are called the Restoration Colonies. And so the Carolinas will get started at this point with the capital of Charlestown. So again, right, Charlestown. But even Carolina, Carol is Latin for Charles. And so, you kind of get this kind of rather boring and yet helpful logic in terms of figuring out, how things are coming into being and not. Now, while Charles was ruling as king, his brother, the Duke of York, conquered the New Netherlands in the name of his brother and was given a chunk of the colony for himself to govern, which he called New York after his title. And New Amsterdam was renamed New York City. Now, Charles II died without any legitimate heirs to the throne. And so his brother, the Duke of York, becomes James II. And James's role is rather significant in our political history because James quickly becomes a bit tyrannical. He had married a Protestant princess and duly produced two daughters, Mary and Anne, who were both married off to German princes. Anne to a German prince, and Anne was married off to William of Orange of the Netherlands. And so when he remarried, when he had a second wife, I believe his first wife died, he married a French princess, and they produced another son that they promptly named Charles, that he announced would be raised Catholic. Now, if you follow English history, ever since Elizabeth came to the throne, or I should say ever since really Henry VIII, her father, was in the throne, there has been a tension about who would be or would not be considered duly appointed sovereigns to take over the throne when the throne was left empty. And so for a very long time in English history, it was okay for a woman to take the throne, but Elizabeth and her sister Mary caused problems because one was technically legitimate, the other was illegitimate, one was Protestant, one was Catholic. I mean, it was a mess. So this was very much of a tension in England. So when James I announced that his son would be baptized Catholic and raised Catholic, this was a signal to the Parliament that the present and future kings would govern by Catholic notions of divine right of kings. And so we get what's called the Glorious Revolution, where the Parliament rose up against the king. The king fled with his son and his court, and the Parliament turned to his oldest Protestant daughter, Mary Stuart, and her husband, William III of Orange. And now, the issue of the Glorious Revolution is that it was bloodless, technically. James fled to Ireland, tried to do an uprising there, and then fled to France. And so the Parliament in 1688 turned to Mary Stuart. Her husband, however, refused to allow her to take the throne if he could not rule jointly with her. Now, if you can kind of follow royal rules, if the woman takes the throne, she's queen, but her consort cannot be any higher than a prince. The Parliament, however, makes a concession here, and we get what's called the dual monarchy of William and Mary. This is a very popular move in the colonies. The couple had to sign a number of documents besides that, but the big one, of course, is going to be the thing on the English Bill of Rights. And our Bill of Rights are modeled greatly upon it. And basically, these are things that the government cannot do to us regardless of who's in the government. And so this is a very monumental thing. And of course, the secession gets clarified as well, because there's a document signed here, the Act of Succession, which eliminated anyone from the line of succession to the English throne if they were Catholic. I believe that rule has been changed, along with the idea that the firstborn male gets the seat first, regardless. I think now it's the firstborn heir, regardless of gender. But we get in play now this idea of limited power. So the Bill of Rights improved the Magna Carta's limitations on power. So now for the British people and future American colonists, that was no taxes were allowed to be levied without the consent of Parliament. And that's a very big idea and concept, this idea of power of the purse. So in 1606, James had established a joint stock company that allowed members to buy shares. And this idea of limited liability allowed for enterprises to grow more rapidly than they would if you had sole proprietorships. And so there really wasn't anything similar to it. But what you're going to find is the French, the Dutch, and the Swedish are all going to mimic this concept of joint stocks and create similar enterprises for their own colonial exploration and settlement. So we get into these differences between English and Spanish colonization attempts. And the joint stock company really plays into that. So because of the joint stock company and proprietorships, England had a very dispersed approach to how colonies were established. And this allowed for more diversity and in many people's opinions, I think, it's afforded a more secure economic and social situation in these colonies, as opposed to a centralized one, which is what you get from the Spanish and from the French. This idea that the monarch knows best, he'll dictate what happens, and then officials in the colonies can simply have an argument as to how the king's wishes get implemented, not as to whether or not it should happen at all. And so what you end up with is a difference that we still see today, right? Market economies as opposed to command economies. And the fact is, England's market economy system flourished quicker and longer than either the Spanish or the French enterprises. The Dutch were as successful in terms of market, but then their military, their naval military situation was weaker than England's, and that's really all that changed that situation there. A command economy, which is what you saw in France and Spain, brought shortages, made people very resentful. It created incredibly poor colonial experiences, particularly for people of color. And, for many people, this proved to be the demise of those situations in the long run. So the Virginia colony would be established in 1607 along the James River and settled inland to hide their colony from the sea. And the Virginia Company itself was named after Queen Elizabeth, who was the Virgin Queen. And so their arrival, however, led to a rather difficult period known as the Starving Time, which, pretty much should tell you everything. And it was primarily because the people sent were all male and didn't have any kind of sense of longevity. They were looking for gold, they were looking for fur trading deals, and they were looking for the Northwest Passage. And so very few of them thought about things like growing food and handling crops and building permanent shelters that could be most useful. And this is a disaster for the colony. So the settlement was aided by Captain John Smith, who would rise in leadership among the colony, because what he did is he essentially brought discipline to the colony. He started to allocate jobs and tasks to people. He punished people for not, being productive. I was about to say his term, which was slovenly. And he goes to the leader of the Powhatan tribe to gain an agreement on trade and other types of relationships. And so Chief Powhatan, it's his daughter, Pocahontas, who supposedly saves John Smith from the axe. But essentially, Pocahontas does not marry John Smith, as the whole myth goes, right? John Smith was just this kind of adventurer slash, mercenary who gets hired by the Virginia Company to come and bring order to the colony. And so these reinforcement attempts that are made are going to come from him. Eventually you're going to have a guy named Lord De La Warr, which is where we get Delaware, who's going to come in and bring military order and deal with the Indians in a much more horrible way, if you will. And so the discovery of tobacco as revenue, however, is what really saves the colony. Because we have to remember that all these colonies were part of a larger mercantilist goal of England. England, as well as France, Spain, the Netherlands, right, latched on to this nationalist economic theory called mercantilism. And this is the belief that one's economy must be entirely self-sufficient. In other words, you must be able to produce all the elements that you need for your economy to thrive. And so, letting some of your gold find its way into the treasury of another country was a major no-no. So for England, they can't grow sugar. Well, then they need to go and get colonies where they can grow sugar. And so all the colonies of these European countries had to have some sort of economic enterprise to make them, shall we say, worth the effort of the crown to keep them going. And for the English, initially, this is tobacco. And it was done in 16... It's always been around, right? It's a weed. And so in 1612, tobacco started to prove itself to be profitable. So in order for that to happen, however, there was a need for labor. And initially, indentured servants were brought from England. The surplus populations that had started to grow in England led many to agree to come to the New World and to endeavor to be slaves for approximately 7 years. At the end of that, the farmer was to give them 50 acres and some tools for them to start doing their own thing. And this baffles modern students to think that somebody would willingly turn themselves over to an institution like slavery, even for just a designated period of time. But what should happen is one should think about that time period. Owning land was a virtually impossible thing for people to do in the 1600s. If you were not already among the landed gentry, the opportunity for you to accumulate enough wealth to actually purchase land, which then, by the way, allowed you to be a voter and to hold office and to take out major loans and all these other activities, it was a virtual impossibility. Here, you were getting 50 acres, which is, a significant sum even in that day and time. And so indentured servants were first brought into use. So John Rolfe and Pocahontas, become the sort of parents, if you will, of indentured servitude because they made this cash crop so profitable. And so there are literally millions of people who trace their lineage back to John Rolfe and Pocahontas because they go back to England. Pocahontas has, I believe, a child, and then she dies at a very young age. But as of the day, on this day, I should say, I'm doing this podcast on August 25th, 2019. And it was actually 400 years yesterday that slavery arrived in Virginia. And so the tragedy of Virginia and of slavery are rather unique because it was also in 1619 that the English people living in Virginia were allowed to establish their own legislature called the House of Burgesses. And so we get this bizarre reality that democracy and tyranny were both born in the same cradle and were to grow up together in the same soil. And this is the tragedy that is slavery in our country. And so what's going to happen, of course, is that as the tobacco industry gets even larger and plantations grow even bigger, the need for slaves grow. And there's really multiple reasons for it, but the few major are the reality of indentured servitude starts to dawn on people. And people start to report back to England that it's not all it's cracked up to be, that it is rather an arduous and cruel reality. And so then the economy in England picks up. And so the push and pull of indentured servitude runs away. The other problem was that farmers in the colonies had to renew their labor force every 7 years, and this was proving to be rather inefficient. And the third was that African slaves were not English citizens, and therefore there weren't the same sort of protections that would have been covered under the English Bill of Rights or the Magna Carta or any part of what was the unwritten English Constitution. And so these are the sort of rationales that are going to lead to the expansion of slavery. It's important to note that slavery was not unique to the American colonies, but the fact that it existed at all is definitely the greatest stain we have in our record. So Governor William Berkeley was not a well-liked governor of Virginia, and he used his authority to help the rich at the expense of the poor. And so what happens is he starts this Green Spring Group, I believe it's called. It's this inner circle of landed people, the head right leaders of Virginia. And they established, I should say, a deerskin trade agreement with Indians and other trading relationships to England that excluded these former indentured servants. Nathaniel Bacon is mistakenly thought of as an indentured servant, and he isn't. Nathaniel Bacon comes to the colonies with money and buys land. So he's not part of that group. However, his land holding was in a less desirable part of the colony, and he therefore did not reap the same kind of financial benefits as the already landed gentry of Virginia, the FFVs, right, the first families of Virginia. And he grew to resent that. And he was snubbed by Berkeley and his inner circle. So what happens is a series of Indian attacks happen. And because these Indians were, let's say, friendly to Berkeley and his crowd, Berkeley was hesitant to send the militia out to defend colonists. And so we get what's called Bacon's Rebellion, and this is in 1676. And this rebellion was really all about power, and it was about people in the periphery being bitter and angry at the self-proclaimed leaders of the colony in Williamsburg. And so this leads to a bunch of indentured servants and former indentured servants joining Bacon in this rebellion. And at one point, Berkeley has to evacuate the capital. He goes out, he orders Berkeley arrested, and but then Berkeley is going to regroup his troops, because what happens is Berkeley flees, but then Bacon died of an illness, and so Berkeley was able to regain control, and any of the surviving people of the group were hanged for treason. And this was really the death knell of servitude, because people were just kind of like, okay, we really can't handle this kind of irreverence. And so if you note, there's sort of like a demarcation point. And for African slaves, their treatment from 1619 to about 1680 was very much in line with the concept of sort of an indentured servant. Many of them were emancipated after a certain number of years. Many of them were given property of their own. Some were allowed to earn their own income. But those start to really go away. And the number of indentured servants is going to dwindle into virtual zero. And obviously the number of slaves increases significantly. So founded in 1634, Maryland was the first colony to be owned by one person and not a joint stock company. And the owner is Lord Baltimore. Cecil Calvert was his name. If you go to Maryland today, you can go to Baltimore City, obviously, which is in Calvert County, Maryland. And the state flag of Maryland, trivial pursuit question there, is the only flag that has a family's coat of arms on it. So So this is our first proprietary colony in the New World because it's owned by one person or proprietor. And Lord Baltimore was a loyal member of the peerage who was Catholic and is basically allowed to create a haven for Catholics in the New World. And the initial capital is going to be in St. Mary's. So tobacco was also the main staple here. Maryland will have a disputed border at one point with Pennsylvania that we'll talk about later. But it becomes a major tobacco grower as well. So for New England, we see a different type of reality. What we talked about before with Virginia and Maryland is something referred to by many as the Chesapeake experience because of the Chesapeake Bay. Here we're going to have the New England experience, right? And the New England colonies were mostly founded by settlers who paid their own way to establish themselves in the New World. So very few were indentured servants. The soil in New England was not conducive to agriculture, certainly not on a commercial scale. And we're going to see what's referred to mostly as subsistence farming. So most of the early settlers did their travels there for purely religious reasons. They wished to worship how and when they pleased. So this narrative starts in the 1620s. So the Plymouth colony was done by the Pilgrims. And the Pilgrims were Puritans who wanted to be completely separate from the Church of England. And so they believed that the Church of England still retained too many Catholic institutions and they needed to be purified. So eventually they crossed the Atlantic and escaped persecution in 1620, and they land in what's called Plymouth colony. So when we talk about Pilgrims, we're talking specifically about the the separatist Puritans who landed in Plymouth Rock. And so now the major contribution they make to American history is that it's really our first written constitution, and it's extremely small, basically one run-on paragraph. But it's the establishment of a body politic for the purpose of serving both the crown and the church, and by church we mean a Calvinist English church. And so when they arrive in 1620, they're late, they're lost, and they land in Cape Cod, New England in November. I mean, so you can imagine this is brutal. And so we get the starving time, which was really about just about a year, really through the winter. But the spring plantings and the harvest is really exceptionally bountiful, and that's where we get our first Thanksgiving in November of 1621. And so that starts our expansion of Calvinist New England. And the next group come 10 years later. So these Puritans were people who were non-separatist. They believed that they had to stay in the Church of England in order to, in a sense, shame it into becoming more Calvinist. So Jonathan Winthrop, who is pictured here, is going to come forward to establish a colony that he said would be a shining city on a hill, or just a city on a hill. A famous sermon on the boat, which was about the model of Christian charity in the New World. And that notion of city upon a hill comes from a biblical reference about Jerusalem being a city on a hill. And that image has resonated throughout American history and becomes really the seed of what we would today call American exceptionalism. And Ronald Reagan in the 1980s will borrow that line, shining of city on a hill, and add shining to it, and it becomes pretty much a standard meme of the Reagan years. Jonathan Winthrop is going to have part in what we're going to call a theocracy. So the New England colonies, particularly Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, are going to basically be church-run settlements. So the Massachusetts Bay Company is going to run the colony, and their leader is Jonathan Winthrop. So the reverend in charge of the church is also the governor in charge of the colony. And so there are going to be a number of laws established to enforce Calvinist principles and to support the workings of the church. So the trading company becomes the government, right? And this obviously has its own problem, if you will. And quickly, dissension falls upon the colony. So now, these strict adherences to Puritan beliefs, there was no room for disagreement, right? And so as a result, disgruntled former residents, would emerge to form other places, right? So, Roger Williams gets into an argument with Winthrop because he believed that those two roles should be separated, that there should be a governor and then there should be a person running the colony. Or excuse me, there should be a governor running the colony and a minister running the church. And this got him into a fight with this belief, right? And Williams believed in the liberty of a man and his ability to communicate with God directly. Now, this didn't go over well with Winthrop, who believed that he was, getting off track. And Williams was banished from the colonies. Now, right away, we see a difference. If he had practiced that same level of, let's just call it heresy, in England, he would have been executed. But in the New World, there's a level of, we'll call it tolerance. Now, it's not very nice. He's banished from the colony. He almost perishes. He stumbles on a place where Narragansett Indians are able to come to his aid, and he believes that he has been the subject of divine providence, and which is why we get Providence, Rhode Island. And, but he's also the beginning of religious tolerance. Roger Williams believed that people should not be compelled to go to church, and they should not be compelled to pay a tax to finance a church that they don't believe in, which were two major practices of the time period almost uniformly throughout Europe. Now, he did this because as a Puritan, he believed that if somebody who doesn't believe is forced to come to your church, they're going to poison the church. But regardless, it was a level of tolerance. You're going to have a Jewish community in Rhode Island. You're going to have Catholics in Rhode Island. Baptists in Rhode Island, which some people actually believe that Roger Williams is one of the founding thinkers of American Baptist faith. I'm sorry. So Anne Hutchinson is another interesting character. She's probably the most famous, if you will, of Rhode Island's early residents. She had latched onto the practice of teaching after the sermons. Puritan ceremonies lasted a long time, and followers of Anne Hutchinson would go back to her home where they would eat and commune together, and they would talk about the sermons. And Hutchinson started to preach something that's referred to as antinomianism, and this is the belief that if you are truly saved, which is the Calvinist belief, that you really aren't tied to the laws of temporal world, particularly if those laws were drafted by people who are not saved. And Anne Hutchinson's teachings are really beyond that of Calvin. But even more importantly, the fact that a woman would be preaching was contrary to Calvinist teaching. So, it becomes a big deal. And Winthrop gets into a fight with her, and she basically starts to question whether Winthrop himself is saved. And that just blows the whole thing out. And so what happens is she's put on trial. And at one point, she trips herself up by saying that she was having conversations with the Holy Spirit. And now she was banished from Massachusetts Bay, and she took up residence in Rhode Island. She became a pain in the neck to Rhode Island, which was hard to do. and she eventually found herself in an English settlement, but it was inside the New Netherlands on Long Island. And she and most of her children were attacked by Indians and were killed, like gruesomely killed. Their heads were bashed in. Winthrop's response upon hearing the news of it said, "'Tis God's will," which is an interesting Christian attitude. But anyway, there were followers of hers, however, that were still in the Massachusetts Bay Company. And this would be people like Jonathan Wheelock. And many of them, because they get fed up with Winthrop, are going to travel north. They're going to go because two gentlemen, Sir Fernando George and Captain John Mason, are given a land grant. Sorry, let me go back here. They're given a land concession for what is today Maine and New Hampshire. Gorge took New Hampshire and Mason took Maine. Due to an overlap of boundaries, which is this whole idea of land issues, Maine and Massachusetts. Eventually, all of Maine was going to be given to Massachusetts, but the New Hampshire settlement draws some of these Hutchinson people up into it to become settlers, and they'll actually lead to the settlement of a place called Dartmouth, which was in fact established by Mr. Wheelock as a school for quote unquote praying Indians. These would be Algonquin Indians that had decided to go through the conversion process of the Puritan faith. So Connecticut now is our first gentleman is Thomas Hooker. He gets into a fight with Winthrop as well, basically because of the strict nature of Massachusetts. And he's going to establish what is part of Hartford, Connecticut, and writes the first truly written constitution in American history called the Fundamental Orders of Commonwealth. And that's why if you ever see Connecticut cars, their license plates say the Constitution State. So in 1633, Connecticut was founded with its legislature drafted called the Fundamental Orders. Now, this is our first sort of state constitution. Jonathan Putnam is and Jonathan Davenport are going to be two gentlemen who felt that Harvard College in Boston and Winthrop himself were not quite Calvinist enough. You know, they wanted a more conservative clergy, and so they created a New Haven for their followers. And so those two groups are eventually going to be put into one colony known as Connecticut. So the English Civil War in New England, as I touched upon before, left the colonies to fend for themselves. And so the New England settlements formed a collective known as the New England Confederation. It included everybody but Rhode Island. And this period of benign neglect allowed for this experience of self-governance. And this is a very big contribution. We're talking about the 1640s. This is way far away from the Revolution. And so people will sometimes argue that it's more of an evolution, because it's here that the colonies get their taste of self-governance. And so for Virginia and Maryland both tried to remain loyal to the crown. Virginia protested the execution of Charles I and would only yield to the Commonwealth when commissioners from England granted it the power to elect their own council of government. So Maryland would enact a Toleration Act in 1649 that protected Puritans there, so that they had the right to worship and they would not be infringed. But it was also in order to protect Catholics living in Maryland, because they were quickly becoming outnumbered, and the fear for the fear was that, Protestant was outnumbered Catholics, and then Catholics would become persecuted like they were in England. So now, what happens is Oliver Cromwell himself becomes a bit of a dictator, and when Cromwell passes away, and there's an attempt to put his son in charge, the Parliament rises up and says, "No, look, if we're going to have a hereditary rulers, we might as well just go back to our royal family." And so Charles II Stuart is restored, and the colonies would seek to obtain their royal charters. So the Restoration colonies, as they are referred to, North and South Carolina, would go to 8 lords who were what were called cavaliers. These were people who defended the crown during the English Civil Wars and had actually paid money to sustain the royal family when they were in exile in France. And so rather than pay back debt, the crown gave land grants to these lords, and the 8 lord proprietors take over the colony of Carolina. Now, right away, there's a problem. The lord proprietors tended to be in the southern part in an area called Charlestown, which is, of course, today Charleston. And the northern open spaces started to be settled by people coming from Virginia. And the colony was named Albemarle, and it was settled in the 1650s. And then what's going to happen, it's going to gain a governor in 1664 and an assembly by 1665. So South Carolina was the focus of the lord proprietors, and they are going to really move in the direction of rice production. And the lord proprietors promoted trade with Indians in the region. So this increased the Indians' chances of exposure to deadly diseases, while at the same time intertwining them, if you will, into the economic pattern of the colonists. So now they became dependent on the British for trade, for things like guns, and then, unfortunately, also for liquor. So enslaving Indians and selling Indians into slavery becomes an actual market for these colonists. Many of the early settlers that come into the southern part of Carolinas are going to be coming from the sugar colonies in the Caribbean. And they bring with them a set of laws on how to deal with slavery, called the Barbados Codes. So in 1680, South Carolina will adopt the Barbados Codes, called the Slave Codes. And this becomes an important thing to remember because they're going to start with slave codes. When slavery ends, the southern states are going to try to simply change the word slave to black. And this is the beginning of segregation in the United States. So it has a very long, dark history. So rice becomes the primary product, but it's actually an interesting story because we get a woman who comes to prominence here, Eliza Pinckney. Eliza Pinckney was a very good example of the status and agency of women in the South and how they differed from that of women in New England. And that's because property rights pass down through sons. But if a son is not of legal age, the land would oftentimes have to be sold as part of an estate, and the son has to grow into maturity, essentially unlanded. So to solve this problem, southern colonies, particularly Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas, will allow land to transfer to the wife to hold in vestiture for the son. Well, this made women very wealthy. Eliza Pinckney outlives 2 husbands and obtains literally thousands and thousands of acres of land. And while the rice market quickly becomes rather saturated, Pinckney discovers this need for indigo, which is a plant that creates a blue dye, which is going to become very big in the textile industry, which is growing in England quite significantly. And so she finds a way to make it a commercially viable product. And she's going to make herself what would today be a millionaire, really. Her sons will go on to sign the Declaration and be a part of the Constitutional Convention and have very major roles. We're going to have Pinckney's Treaty in 1795. And George Washington will be an honorary pallbearer at her funeral. So it's she becomes a rather significant figure at a time that's very, very dominated by men. And so the split with North Carolina really is about this kind of rivalry over products and over leadership. So North Carolina really doesn't get its own separate charter until, I believe, 1714 or something like that. So the middle colonies, of course, are really what we call the New Netherlands. And in fact, you'll notice on this map that there's a little section called New Sweden, which starts in the 1630s and goes to 1655. So the Swedish had started a fur trading network, and the Delaware River Valley was the primary area for that. So the colony of Delaware was essentially New Sweden for a long time. Now what happens is the Dutch leader Stuyvesant is going to lead a group down from New Netherlands and conquer New Sweden and incorporate it in there. And so the Dutch were slowly losing their grip on the empire. So what happens is, as I stated before, James, Duke of York, is going to go in there and take it over. And what you're going to see is the King of England, which is Charles II, and then James II, they're basically going to divvy it up. And so James was given the Hudson River Valley and the Long Island area and New Amsterdam, which, as I said earlier, becomes New York with New York City. New Jersey is formed in 1702 when parts of New York were separated and made into a separate royal colony. There were actually two gentlemen. They were Quakers, East Jersey and West Jersey. This named after the island, the Isle of Jersey. And Pennsylvania then was formed by William Penn and his Quaker followers. So unlike Winthrop, Penn encouraged members of all denominations to move to his colony. And Delaware was also given to Penn. And so in 1704, it would choose its own assembly, but share the Penn family as a governor, if you will. And then in the South, we get Georgia as the last of the colonies. And there's quite a gap here. Georgia was created as a buffer state. And it was done so because the Spanish Floridas had a lot of lawlessness in it, if you will. And a lot of Indians and Spanish settlers would get kind of hostile. And so in 1733, the Crown will issue a charter to a social reformer named James Oglethorpe. And he will set up a colony in Georgia at Savannah and try to create plantations to grow wine and mulberry bushes to feed silkworms. And so he thought that he was going to start a wine and silk industry there. And what's interesting is he outlawed slavery. There would be no slavery. It was supposed to be a reform colony for former debtor prisoners from England to come over and get a second chance. So this was a reform movement that he did. And England allowed him to do that basically because they wanted a buffer. It's kind of like the English version of Operation Human Shield, if you will. But anyhow, that's their creation. And so we get these, and these are interesting documents, right? You know, this primary source document gets played rather well here, and because if you look at it, it's a document that's being done by Europeans about Native Americans, but it has this kind of like, wow, this is kind of a cool thing. And we get this interesting dual nature of European attitudes, or I should say English attitudes towards Indians. Many English people saw them as savages. However, we're in the early period of the Enlightenment, and what we're going to see is that a number of colonists see these Indians, so for instance, Benjamin Franklin, is going to admire them, see them as what the Enlightenment people referred to as the noble savage, right? Because man in a state of nature is inherently good and inherently free. Indians are going to be seen by many Europeans, and particularly Englishmen, as people who embodied these ideals. And so this becomes rather significant. However, this idea that they are still outside of the realm of salvation becomes a big deal, particularly with New Englanders, because New Englanders embraced Calvinism, and Calvinism believed that you're saved or you're damned. And so their fate is going to be left up to just exactly how English settlers viewed them, right? And now, this is a photograph of a 17th century Jewish cemetery that's in New York City. The first settlers of Jewish descent arrived in 1654 and were almost thrown out of New York. So they were forced to be accepted when the Dutch West India Company ordered they be allowed to stay. So even though they're going to be kind of restrained in terms of how many rights and property privileges they're going to be given, that's still a rather early showing for members of the Jewish community. Quakers were also a very interesting group. They were persecuted in Europe, in England, ever since they had started. The name itself was a derogatory term. They were officially called the Society of Friends. And this picture is showing a woman standing to preach. If you follow the sort of tenets that are there, which is a rather interesting thing for the time period, there was no hierarchy, and there is no hierarchy in the Quaker faith. There are no official priests or whatever, and no hierarchy. And so the meetings were basically people who just gathered together for prayer, led by elders, and anyone who feels called by the Spirit to share can simply stand up and do so. And this included women. This is very, very progressive for the time period. The fact that a woman could have as much spiritual authority as a man is really very significant for the time period. And the name Quaker comes to the fact that when these people were witnessed in their worship, some who were in the throes of the Holy Spirit would quake out of fear. And so that's where they had obtained their call it their nickname, let's say. Okay, so the native peoples of the English settlers, right? The settlers in New England were principally fundamental Christians who viewed it as their duty to convert the land and its people to Christianity. They found no ethical dilemma in taking the land from its original inhabitants. In many of these areas, as the Anglo settlers moved in, the natives were forced out. Some fought back or died from diseases, even before the settlers arrived. So, for instance, when the Pilgrims arrive in New England, well over 75% have already been decimated. They literally came upon Indian villages completely abandoned and simply dug around and find their stores of corn in order to survive that first winter. Initially, the natives helped English settlers on the coast, but once the settlements began to flourish, they found themselves unable to stop encroachment on their lands. So in New England, in 1636, a Pequot was accused of murdering a colonist. For revenge, the colonists set fire to a Pequot village and killed its inhabitants. So then the Pequot, in turn, fought back. And by 1638, a few surviving Pequots had signed the Treaty of Hartford, and the Pequot nation ceased to exist. And what we see here in 1674, we get something called King Philip's War. So King Philip was a leader of the Wampanoags and resented the colony's attempts to convert Native Americans to Christianity. and so he prepared for war. A spy, however, warned the colonists, but when that spy was found murdered, the colonists responded by executing 3 Wampanoags. So Philip began to fight back, right? And again, the colonists won, and the Wampanoags eventually went into extinction. And this gives us a sort of important thing to remember. You don't have to kill everybody in an ethnic group to wipe them out. And acts of genocide are not always successful in its entirety, but we get what's called virtual extinction because these people are no longer, the ones that remain are no longer able to have a stable, sustainable population and are most often forced to move to other parts of North America. Well, for traditional societies, changing their geography changes their culture. And so they cease to exist as the people that they were and have to become literally something else. And it's a tragic reality of American history that always has to be confronted face on. And this is happening all up and down the eastern seaboard of what will become the United States of America. An exception to this is the Tuscarora and Yamasee Wars. The Yamasee tribe is going to be driven into extinction, but the Tuscarora are not. Rather than submit, the Tuscarora are going to move north and join a larger group of Algonquin Algonquin nations that are going to be referred to as the Iroquois. Here we see the Algonquin celebrating the harvest, a religious belief system that's very tied to natural realities and natural spirits. Here we have an advertisement in the Virginia Gazette on October of 1779 for indentured servants. So they're still trying to get them in, right? So the servants are going to endure years of labor before their contracts expired, and many are going to find that the reward that they were promised in the end doesn't really manifest itself. So by 1700, enslaved Africans make up about 11% of the total population in the American colonies. So slavery was much more common in the Chesapeake colonies and the Carolinas. The slaves that came to America were mostly West African, as you can see from this map. And so slavery in Africa was much less brutal than it was in the Americas. Slavery in Africa was really about conquest of a tribe. And so slavery was done in order for the victors to get rid of the losers and to get money for them, and so those coming in what's referred to as the Middle Passage, 1 in every 6 Africans are going to die in the Middle Passage. This alone is enough to condemn the practice. Again, slavery is happening globally at this time period and continues for a very long period of time. Some would argue that there's slavery today in many parts of the world, but we're going to concern ourselves with our own sins, if we will. Slave culture, however, is the redeeming reality, if you will. It is the only good that comes out of it. The beauty, the art, the literature eventually that's going to come out of this, the music, these are the things that survive slavery, that in a sense conquers slavery in a way that only the human spirit could do. And so this document, of course, of the Middle Passage shows just how human beings were treated as cargo. This diagram is from 1808. It's an interesting one because it's in 1808 that the United States will outlaw the importation of slaves. This shows us a wonderful piece of a African slave marriage ceremony. So marriages were not legal between blacks in the United States really until the late 1800s. But this was an old West African ceremony referred to as jumping the broom. When my sister and her husband were married, he is African American, and it was really kind of fun because they actually did jump the broom at the end of their vows, which was fantastic. So the idea here, the musical instruments, the pottery, a lot of the dietary stuff, adaptations of religion and music and all this other stuff. These are all uniquely African realities that are going to become very deeply ingrained in American popular culture, and what I would sort of refer to as a sweet revenge, as it were. So with that, we get to the end of chapter 2. And I will look forward to seeing you or having you listen up next week to get to our next chapter. Bye-bye.